Hi, and welcome back. This is Spectre P, and we are Spectre AI. Living off the land attacks are not exotic exploits, 0 days, or novel malware families. They are the quiet weaponization of what already exists inside trusted environments, and that is precisely why they become more dangerous, not less, in a quantum-era threat model. Because the attacker is not injecting capability, they are harvesting it. Blending administrative tools, native binaries, trusted scripts, credential caches, orchestration layers, and long-standing operational assumptions into an attack surface that looks indistinguishable from normal behavior. And when you combine that with quantum-accelerated inference, faster hypothesis testing, and dramatically reduced uncertainty per observation, the defender's traditional advantage collapses, because detection systems built on anomaly thresholds assume slow convergence, sparse evidence, and long dwell times. While the attacker now operates in a regime where confidence accumulates rapidly, lateral movement can be simulated before execution, and the safest operating region becomes one where the attacker never leaves the statistical envelope of legitimacy, meaning security controls still fire, logs are still written, and alerts still exist, but they no longer discriminate. Intent, only activity, and that distinction matters because living off the land in a quantum-era context is not about speed. It is about certainty, about knowing which command will succeed before it is run, which identity can be reused without detection, which trust boundary will not collapse when stressed, and which defensive assumptions were never designed to face an adversary who learns faster than the system can adapt. So what looks like normal operational hygiene on the surface becomes the attack itself underneath, and the critical shift is not new tooling, but a new understanding of how confidence, inference, and exploitation converge when the environment itself becomes the weapon. Living off the land attacks are dangerous not because they rely on exotic malware, but because they deliberately avoid it. Instead of introducing new binaries, attackers repurpose tools that already exist inside the environment, tools that administrators use every day, tools that security teams are conditioned to trust. PowerShell, WMI, Certudal, PSECsec, scheduled tasks, registry keys, native scripting engines. None of these are suspicious on their own, and that's precisely the point. The attacker doesn't need to break in loudly when they can blend in quietly, operating entirely within what looks like normal system behavior. Credential material is harvested from memory or replayed from cache. Lateral movement occurs through legitimate remote execution frameworks. Persistence is established through scheduled tasks that look indistinguishable from routine maintenance jobs, and command execution happens through signed binaries that endpoint defenses are designed not to block. From the outside, this activity resembles ordinary administration. From inside the network, it looks like noise. The attack surface doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. It hides in plain sight, exploiting the gap between what is technically allowed and what is semantically malicious. And that gap is where traditional security models fail, because they assume threats arrive as foreign objects rather than emerging from the environment itself. Living off the land attacks invert the defender's trust model, turning operational convenience into a weapon, and forcing detection systems to answer a much harder question, not whether something is allowed to run, but whether it should be running at all. What makes living off the land attacks so difficult to defend against isn't sophistication in malware. It's the absence of malware entirely. These attacks deliberately avoid introducing new binaries, exploits, or signatures. Instead, they repurpose tools that already exist, tools that administrators rely on every single day to keep systems running. From a defender's perspective, this collapses the traditional security model. PowerShell, WMI, scheduled tasks, service control managers, and credential stores are not suspicious by default. They are foundational components of modern enterprise operations. When an attacker uses these same mechanisms, The activity blends seamlessly into normal administrative noise. Detection systems that rely on known indicators of compromise struggle here. There's no malicious hash to block, no obvious payload to quarantine, and often no clear point of initial exploitation. What defenders are left with is behavior, subtle deviations in timing, frequency, privilege usage, or command chaining. And behavioral signals are inherently probabilistic, not deterministic. This creates an asymmetric problem. Attackers only need to look normal enough for long enough. Defenders, on the other hand, must maintain continuous visibility across identity, endpoint, and process telemetry, and then correctly distinguish malicious intent from legitimate operations, without breaking business workflows. The challenge deepens when persistence is involved. Scheduled tasks, registry modifications, and service abuse can survive reboots, updates, and even partial remediation efforts, all while remaining indistinguishable from routine system maintenance. By the time defenders notice something is wrong, the attacker may already be operating entirely inside trusted execution paths. In short, living off the land attacks don't break systems. They exploit trust. And defending against them requires a shift away from static rules and toward continuous, context-aware reasoning about how systems are actually being used over time. Living off the land attacks are difficult to detect, not because they are sophisticated in isolation, but because they deliberately collapse the distinction between malicious activity and normal system administration. Every command shown here, PowerShell execution, WMI queries, credential cache access, scheduled tasks, registry modification, exists to keep enterprise systems running, and defenders have spent decades tuning their environments to allow these behaviors at scale. When an attacker operates entirely inside that permitted envelope, signature-based detection fails immediately, IOC-driven alerts go quiet, and even behavior-based systems struggle because the individual actions look statistically normal. The challenge is that intent is no longer encoded in tools, malware, or binaries. It emerges only across time, correlation, and sequence. A PowerShell command is benign. A scheduled task is benign. Credential reuse is common. But when these actions are chained, replayed, and subtly adapted across hosts, the attack surface hides inside baseline noise. This forces defenders to shift from static rules toward inference, tracking context drift, privilege asymmetries, temporal reuse, and decision acceleration. In other words, the problem is not visibility, but interpretation. Living off-the-land attacks succeed because defenders see everything, but cannot immediately prove anything is wrong, and by the time confidence emerges, the attacker has already moved laterally, persisted, and reshaped the environment to look even more normal than before. We see here why living off the land attacks fundamentally break classical detection assumptions when you look at them through a statistical lens. Most security systems implicitly assume that malicious behavior introduces new distributions into telemetry, meaning new binaries, new process trees, or anomalous network flows, but LotL attacks deliberately stay inside the existing probability space. If we model system behavior as a random variable x with baseline distribution p of x, classical detection relies on identifying deviations where p of x given attack diverges measurably from p of x given normal. In LotL scenarios, that divergence is intentionally minimized, so the likelihood ratio test never crosses a reliable threshold. Even worse, when attackers replay cached credentials, reuse signed binaries, and persist through native schedulers, the Fisher information gained per observation collapses, which means the variance of our parameter estimates remains high even as we collect more data. In practical terms, confidence grows too slowly to be actionable. This is why defenders experience alert fatigue without convergence, while attackers operate safely inside what looks like a statistically valid operating region. The math here isn't academic. It explains why adding more logs, more rules, or more heuristics doesn't fix the problem. Without changing the inference model itself, the system cannot distinguish between malicious intent and legitimate administration, because mathematically, they occupy the same space. Living off the land attacks force defenders to confront a fundamental asymmetry. Attackers are not introducing obviously malicious tools. They are exploiting the same native utilities and trust relationships that defenders rely on to operate the system. Effective defense therefore starts with shifting away from signature-based thinking and toward behavior, context, and timing. Instead of asking whether a tool is malicious, defenders must ask whether its usage makes sense in that moment, on that system, and for that identity. That means aggressively baselining normal administrative behavior, tracking command line arguments, execution chains, parent-child process relationships, and privilege transitions, and then flagging deviations that accumulate over time rather than triggering on a single event. Controls like constrained PowerShell, application control, and credential hygiene reduce attack surface, but they are not sufficient on their own. The real leverage comes from correlating low-signal events across time, hosts, and users to expose persistence, lateral movement, and credential replay that would otherwise blend into background noise. Logging must be deep, retained long enough to capture slow-burn campaigns, and analyzed with an understanding that attackers optimize for plausibility, not speed. Ultimately, defending against living-off-the-land techniques is less about blocking tools and more about understanding intent, because when the environment itself becomes the weapon, the only reliable defense is visibility into how that environment is actually being used. At this stage, the most dangerous failures aren't technical gaps, they're cognitive ones, because living-off-the-land attacks succeed precisely where defenders believe they are safe. Security teams implicitly trust native tools, assuming that signed binaries, administrative scripts, and built-in schedulers represent legitimate behavior, when in reality they are simply convenient delivery vehicles for an adversary who understands the environment better than the defender does. Detection systems are tuned to look for novelty, exploits, and malware artifacts, not for intent, so when an attacker blends into routine operational noise, every alert threshold works against the defender rather than for them. Over time, defenders normalize anomalies, whitelist behaviors that were never truly understood, and slowly train their own systems to ignore the very signals that indicate compromise. This creates a feedback loop where the attacker adapts faster than the detection logic, shrinking the defender's window of certainty while expanding the attacker's safe operating region. By the time something is flagged, it often appears as a compliance issue or performance anomaly rather than an intrusion, and response teams are forced into retrospective forensics instead of real-time containment. In other words, the failure is not that tools are weak, but that confidence is misplaced. And in living-off-the-land scenarios, misplaced confidence is the most exploitable vulnerability in the entire system. Classical detection systems struggle with living-off-the-land attacks because they are fundamentally built to look for deviation, not legitimacy abused over time. And that distinction matters more than most defenders realize. Traditional SOC tooling is optimized around signatures, static indicators, and short-window behavioral thresholds, which works well for commodity malware but fails when an adversary deliberately blends into normal administrative activity. PowerShell, WMI, scheduled tasks, registry edits, and credential reuse all occur legitimately every day in enterprise environments, so the signal-to-noise ratio is extremely low. Attackers exploit this by operating slowly, chaining benign actions, and staying below alert thresholds that were never designed to reason about intent or long-horizon correlation. Even modern EDR platforms often rely on heuristic scoring that resets over time. meaning persistence techniques that unfold across days or weeks never accumulate enough risk to trigger decisive action. The result is an attacker operating entirely inside trusted execution paths, producing logs that look correct in isolation but malicious in aggregate. Classical detection fails not because the data is missing, but because the inference model is fundamentally limited, unable to integrate weak signals across time, context, and uncertainty. This is the core detection gap that living off the land techniques exploit, and it's why defenders continue to miss attacks even in environments saturated with telemetry. When we move beyond classical detection, the core problem becomes clear. Traditional security tooling was designed to catch violations of known rules, not to reason about intent, adaptation, or long-term behavior drift. Living off-the-land attacks exploit this gap by staying inside policy boundaries while gradually reshaping the environment, blending malicious objectives into legitimate workflows. From a defender's perspective, every individual action looks benign, but the aggregate behavior tells a very different story. This is where classical detection begins to fail, because it treats events independently rather than as part of a probabilistic sequence evolving over time. Advanced adversaries take advantage of this by spacing actions across days or weeks, rotating native tools, and deliberately injecting noise to prevent correlation. The result is an attack that never triggers a hard alert but steadily converges toward compromise. To counter this, defenders must shift from static rule enforcement to inference-based reasoning, where confidence is accumulated across observations instead of reset after each event. This means modeling systems as dynamic processes, tracking how likelihood evolves as behaviors compound, and recognizing that security is no longer about catching a single malicious act, but about identifying when normal activity begins to deviate toward an adversarial objective. In a quantum-era threat model, this shift is not optional. It is the minimum requirement for keeping pace with attackers who understand that stealth is no longer about hiding, but about looking indistinguishable from normal operations until it is too late. This depiction is really about reframing how detection works when attackers live off the land, because traditional security assumes that malicious activity looks statistically different from normal behavior, while living off the land attacks deliberately erase that distinction by operating entirely inside legitimate administrative tooling and expected workflows. In this regime, what matters is not whether an action is allowed, signed, or commonly observed, but whether the sequence, timing, and context of actions gradually shifts the underlying likelihood that an adversary is present. Each individual event appears benign, but confidence accumulates across observations, and that accumulation happens much faster for an attacker than for a defender relying on static thresholds or binary alerts. The key idea is probabilistic convergence. Defenders wait for certainty. Attackers exploit ambiguity. By the time classical systems trigger, the attacker has already operated deep inside what looks like normal behavior. Effective defense therefore requires modeling confidence as a continuously evolving signal rather than a yes or no decision, where small deviations compound over time instead of being evaluated in isolation. This is why living off the land attacks persist undetected for weeks or months. Not because they are invisible, but because our detection logic converges too slowly compared to the attacker's rate of inference and adaptation. What makes living off the land attacks strategically dangerous is not any single technique, but the asymmetry they create between attackers and defenders. Adversaries no longer need custom malware, 0 days, or noisy exploit chains. They can operate entirely inside tools that enterprises already trust, already deploy, and already whitelist. That collapses the traditional distinction between normal operations and hostile activity. Detection systems that rely on signatures, static thresholds, or fixed behavioral baselines are structurally mismatched to this threat model, because the attacker is adapting faster than the defender can re-baseline. At scale, this shifts cyber conflict from prevention to inference, from blocking events to reasoning over intent, accumulation, and time. Strategically, this matters now because enterprise environments are becoming more automated, more cloud-native, and more policy-driven, which increases both attack surface and ambiguity. The same orchestration that enables resilience also enables stealth. For defenders, the implication is clear. Security can no longer be a binary decision engine. It must become a probabilistic system that continuously evaluates confidence, context, and convergence across observations. Organizations that fail to make this shift will not be breached loudly. They will be lived in quietly, and the longer an adversary remains undetected, the more the balance of power tilts irreversibly in their favor. The key takeaway from this discussion is that modern cyber attacks are no longer about exploiting exotic vulnerabilities or deploying obviously malicious tools. Instead, the most effective adversaries operate quietly, using what already exists inside trusted environments, blending into normal administrative behavior. Static defenses, fixed thresholds, and signature-based detection simply cannot keep pace with adaptive attackers who learn, probe, and evolve in real time. Security today is less about blocking every action and more about understanding behavior, uncertainty, and intent over time. If defenders don't shift toward probabilistic, adaptive, and context-aware models, they will continue to lose visibility precisely where attacks are most dangerous, inside the systems they already trust. Thank you for watching. If you found this useful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep building deep, real-world quantum security content. You can visit spectreai.ai to explore over 55 hands-on quantum security labs and learn by doing, not just by theory. If you're interested in going deeper, you can also find our books on Amazon. And finally, leave a comment and let us know what you'd like to learn next. We read them all. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.